This video for basic sentential logic, informal fallacies, and cognitive biases. This video is for chapter 1, although it actually corresponds to material that's in the introduction section of the text. The topics that I'm going to cover in this video are: what is logic, what is logical form, what are informal fallacies, and what are cognitive biases. The first topic is, what is logic? And because that's the topic of the text and the topic of the course. Very roughly, logic is the study of reasoning. And reasoning is a process of going from some given facts or information or even assumptions to some new information or some new fact. To put it another way, it's determining what follows and what doesn't follow from what. So a good way to illustrate this is with what I'll call the pizza argument. So the background here is that I was at LAX a long time ago, and I was sitting in the gate, and there was a family sitting next to me, parents, a young girl and a young boy, about 8 or 10. And the kids were hungry, so the dad said he would go get personal pizzas for everyone. So the girl said that she wanted a cheese pizza, the boy wanted a pepperoni pizza. The dad goes away, he comes back, he has 2 small pizza boxes, he puts them on a little table in front of the seats. The girl gets up from her chair, goes over to the boxes, picks up one box, opens it, sees a pepperoni pizza. She closes that box, goes to the other box, and just picks it up without opening it and goes back to her seat. So she somehow knew, without looking, that that box had a cheese pizza in it. So we can represent, now this was reasoning that she went through. That's how she knew. She didn't look, but she actually reasoned, as I'll demonstrate in a second, to the conclusion that there was a cheese pizza in the box. Here's basically how that reasoning went. She knew that either the pizza in her hand was a cheese pizza or a pepperoni pizza, and she knew it wasn't pepperoni, and so she knew that it had to be a cheese pizza. Okay? And here we see an example of going from some given information. In this case, the information she started with was this: either the pizza that she picked up was cheese or it was pepperoni. And she also knew that it wasn't pepperoni. So those were the 2 pieces of information she started with. And from those, she knew there was a third thing that followed. Namely, that the pizza that was in her hand had to be a cheese pizza, the one in the box. And she knew that not because she looked in the box again, but because she knew it followed from pieces of information she already had. Here's another example. Bob says, "I don't know why your plants are dead. I watered them twice while you were gone." So Alice asks Bob to water her plants for her while she's on vacation. She comes back, the plants are dead. Bob says this: "I don't know why they're dead. I watered them twice." Alice responds, "You couldn't have watered the plants. If you'd watered them, then you'd have had to use the hose, but it's in the same exact position it was in when I left." Now, this is another example where Alice didn't directly check on this piece of information, that Bob didn't water the plants. She didn't have video cameras. She wasn't there looking. But she did have other pieces of information. And the fact that Bob didn't water the plants followed from those other pieces of information. Okay, in this case, the information she started with is that in order to water the plants, you'd have to move the hose, and the hose is in the exact same position it was in when I left. The hose hasn't been moved. And she knows that from those pieces of information, some new thing follows, namely Bob didn't water my plants. So that's what logic is. Logic is the study of reasoning, and reasoning is this process we just talked about, where you have some pieces of information and you think something follows from those. And maybe it really does follow, maybe it really doesn't. And logic is the study of that process. why is logic important? Why is there a whole course devoted to it? Well, reasoning governs almost everything you do. A huge amount of what you do every day comes from reasoning. And not just the things that you might think of as really important, deciding whether to quit smoking or who to vote for, right? These things that we think of as big decisions. But even small things like, should I put my shoes on or just walk around the house without shoes this morning? Which route should I take home after work or after school or something like that? Furthermore, a lot of human reasoning is bad. A lot of it is good, but a lot of it is very, very bad. And moreover, there's a lot of groups, including political campaigns and advertising agencies, and sometimes just other individuals like salespeople. They know that human reasoning is bad, and they know how to manipulate human reasoning for their own goals, for their own ends. And so to the extent that you study logic and get better at it, you will be a little bit more resistant to that sort of manipulation. So that's a very rough overview of what logic is. It's the study of reasoning, and reasoning is a process of going from some information to some new information. And if the reasoning is good, that new piece of information really does follow from the starting point. Sometimes if it's bad, the new piece of information doesn't actually follow, but someone thinks it does, and that's bad reasoning. Now, what is sentential logic? The textbook is Basic Sentential Logic, Informal Fallacies and Cognitive Biases. So there's 3 components to the title of the textbook. The first component is sentential logic. What does that mean? Well, in a lot of cases, not all cases, but in many cases, what makes reasoning good or bad has to do with the formal features of the reasoning. Okay, don't worry, I'll get back to sentential logic in a minute. So what do I mean by formal feature of reasoning? Well, I'm going to start with an analogy. So here we have in the upper left a kid's face, and that face has a certain shape. And you might think, well, I want to make something else that has that same shape. Maybe I want to make a statue of that kid's face for some reason. Well, one way you could do it is you could put make a mold. You sort of put some sort of plastic or polyurethane coating on. When it dries, you peel it off, and now you have something that's roughly the same shape as this kid's face as a mold. And then you can fill this mold up with other stuff like clay or brass or plaster or whatever. And you can make this thing, which is the same shape as the original face, but it's filled with different stuff, right? This one is filled with bones and skin and biological material. This is the same shape, but here this shape is filled with brass or plaster or whatever this is. So think of form as something like shape. Okay. Well, what's the form of a piece of reasoning? What does that even mean? The form of reasoning. Well, let's go back to the pizza argument. So the pizza argument, or the piece of reasoning that captured the LAX girl's reasoning was this. Either the pizza in my hand is a cheese pizza or it's a pepperoni pizza. It's not a pepperoni pizza, therefore it must be a cheese pizza. The form of this is either X or Y, not Y, therefore X. Okay? And so now hopefully it's a little more clear what it means by form. It's a kind of a shape, and once we see that shape, we see that you could fill that shape with different things. In this case, this shape is filled with content about pizzas, right? The X and the Y have to do with whether a pizza is cheese or pepperoni. Okay, but we could fill this same shape here with different stuff. And I could say either it will rain today or I will have to water the garden tomorrow. It will not rain today, therefore I'll have to water the garden tomorrow. And that has the same form, either X or Y, not Y, therefore X. It's the same form, but it's filled with different content. In this case, the content is about rain and watering the garden. Now, the first part of the title is sentential logic because the form we're going to be interested in, that we're going to be studying, is the form that we get when we replace the sentences with variables. And so these x's, these variables here, this x and this y in this case, these are taking the place of sentences. So in the original pizza argument, we removed the sentences, replaced them with variables, and then we saw that we could just if we wanted to, we could put different sentences in for those same variables, just like we could make the shape of that kid's face, and we could then fill that shape with different things. But the shape itself is one thing, and what it's filled with is something else. So that's what sentential logic means. It means it's the study of the form of certain kinds of reasoning, and it's the form we get when we replace sentences with variables, roughly. And the reason we're doing that is a lot of the time, whether a piece of reasoning is good or bad has nothing to do with whether it's about pizza or watering gardens. It has to do with the form. This piece of reasoning has a good form, so no matter what you fill that x and y with, that's a good piece of reasoning. So that's the first topic in the text. The second one, and this is the first 4 chapters out of 6, will be on these formal topics. What are informal fallacies? This is chapter 5. Well, the rough definition is informal fallacies are some common patterns of reasoning that are often bad, but they're bad for reasons other than the formal features of the argument. There's something about the content that makes it bad. And so if you extract all the content away, you can't really see why that argument is good or bad. There's something about what it means that is key to understanding why that piece of reasoning is a good or bad piece of reasoning. So for example, every time Le'Veon Bell carries more than 30 times, the Steelers win. So not a running back for the Steelers anymore. This is a bit outdated, but the starting piece of information is that every time a certain player on this football team runs the football, carries the football more than a certain number of times, in this case 30, his team wins. The conclusion this person is drawing is that all Tomlin, the head coach, has to do to keep the Steelers winning is to give the ball to Bell at least 30 times a game. Well, that's a bad piece of reasoning. But the reason it's bad has to do specifically with the content. It has to do with the fact that this is about a certain kind of causal claim that's being derived from a correlation. It's called false cause. Sometimes this piece of bad reasoning has other names. But it's an example of an informal fallacy. It's one of the fallacies we'll be talking about at length in chapter 5. What are cognitive biases? This is chapter 6. This will be the last chapter of the book and the last topic. Cognitive biases are roughly psychological influences on belief formation that often lead to holding of erroneous beliefs. Okay, now, so you can see that the way I've described it, they're not directly problems with reasoning, but they're connected, because if the information you start with is bad, then when you reason on the basis of that, you won't necessarily derive true conclusions from that reasoning, for instance. So, and there's other ways it can be connected as well. But let me give you an example. Altogether, we'll be talking about 6 cognitive biases. But one of them, and in fact the first one that we'll be talking about, is the confirmation bias. And the confirmation bias is a psychological influence that everyone has, where people tend to try to confirm their prior beliefs and tend to try to avoid questioning their prior beliefs. Right? So we have a bias towards confirming certain things we already believe or things we want to believe. And so some ways this manifests is you're more likely to seek out pieces of information that confirm the beliefs that you already have and that you like. you'll be much less likely to seek out disconfirming information or information that's inconsistent with those beliefs. You're more likely to remember things that confirm your beliefs and to forget anything that's inconsistent with your beliefs. So those are some examples of how the confirmation bias manifests. And you can see how this can lead to people holding and maintaining false beliefs, right? If your belief is false, but you just ignore all the evidence that it's false, and you focus instead on, let's say, those few pieces of information or evidence that are consistent with it, then you can just maintain any beliefs you want, typically. So that's an example of a cognitive bias, and that'll be chapter 6. So in any case, that's it for this video. In the next video, we're going to get a start on the formal logic.